heartiest welcome to this special event, SEAPAC Webinar 2021, Enforcing Measures to Combat Bribery, Comparative Analysis on the Anti-Bribery Legislations, UK and Southeast Asia. This webinar is organized jointly by SEAPAC, the House of Representatives of the Republic of Indonesia, and Westminster Foundation for Democracy. SEAPAC is a network of Southeast Asian parliamentarians who have common concerns and focus on issues of anti-corruption and good governance. Along with its members from 7 countries across the region, SEAPAC aims to establish a strong advocacy network that works through capacity building, facilitation of research, as well as sharing best practices and lessons learned among members of parliaments. Ladies and gentlemen, before we commence the event today, we will have a brief profile of SEAPAC. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will now commence with the first opening remarks from the President of SEAPAC, Honorable Chairperson of the Committee for Interparliamentary Cooperation of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Dr. Fadli Zon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be upon us all. Honorable Datuk Hasanuddin bin Muhammad Yunus, Vice President of SEAPAC, Mr. Franklin de Vrieze, WFD Senior Governance Advisor, Honorable Indonesia Members of Parliament, Honorable Cambodia Members of Parliament, Honorable Malaysia Members of Parliament, Honorable Thailand Members of Parliament, Honorable Timor-Leste Members of Parliament, Honorable SEAPAC members, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure on behalf of SEAPAC to welcome you all to this SEAPAC webinar organized jointly with the Indonesian House of Representatives and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, entitled enforcing measures to combat bribery, comparative analysis on anti-bribery legislations in the UK and Southeast Asia. First, I would like to express my appreciation to the Westminster Foundation for Democracy for the long-standing partnership and collaboration with the Indonesian House Committee for Interparliamentary Cooperation, SEAPAC and GOPAC Indonesia. It is nice to see some familiar colleagues again after the last SEAPAC webinar that was held in February. Since then, we have been actively involved through GOPAC to contribute suggestions for the unguessed political declaration. We also continuously raise awareness of parliamentarians' role in eradicating corruption through international agenda meetings, such as the unguessed special session and UN Fact panel, among others. We will stay actively engaged in the international anti-corruption global movement by implementing programs and expanding our network by inviting our fellow parliamentarians colleagues in the Southeast Asian region. As a parliamentary network dedicated to fighting against corruption, SEAPAC is committed to foster, collaborate, and advocate anti-corruption efforts and promote good governance at the regional and international levels. SEAPAC is a platform for us, parliamentarians, to learn from each other and share our best practices to combat corruption. Distinguished participants, combating bribery is a key to uphold effective public services and good governance. Due to the practices of bribery, billions of resources that are supposed to be public initiatives funds or investments have long been foregone, have been looted by the corruptors. This drain of capital without a doubt creates detrimental effects on society and disrupts the country's economic growth. Especially during these pandemic times, we need to stay vigilant as there are increasing cases of bribery due to potential misuse of funds and abuse of powers in the disbursement of the COVID-19 reliefs. Eliminating bribery has always been a priority since the establishment of the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2003. Articles 15, 16, and 21 encourage state parties to adopt measures of bribery criminalization and law enforcement to the national public officials, the foreign public officials, and officials of international organizations, and also the private sector. The recent unguessed political declaration also reaffirms member states' commitment to reinforce the anti-bribery measures in the national context. Other measures, such as OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, also has been established as legally binding standards to criminalize international bribery transaction. Many countries have adopted and set standards into their national legislation, such as the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and UK Bribery Act, as well as the German Criminal Code. Others are also following the creating such regulation, although the success is varied in many other territories. The effort to produce comprehensive anti-bribery legislation has been growing in the past few years in the Southeast Asia region. In Indonesia, bribery is regulated under Law Number 11, 1980 of the Criminal Act of Bribery and Law Number 20, 2001 on the eradication of corruption crimes. Singapore enacted bribery legislation through the Prevention of Corruption Act in 1960. In 2018, Thailand expanded the definitions of persons who can commit bribery to include foreign companies under Thailand's Act supplementing the Constitution relating to the prevention and suppression of corruption. Timor-Leste has just adopted anti-corruption law number 7 in 2020 to criminalize bribery crimes. Lastly, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act, amended in 2020, has included the provision of corporate liability for bribery and corruption. With a vast diversity in history, socio-economic, and political interests, I believe our region will provide an appealing analysis of anti-bribery policies comparison and enrich the study of anti-bribery law around the world. Distinguished delegates, today's webinar is a commitment of SEAPAC to provide a forum where parliamentarians could gather, discuss, and share their best practices of anti-bribery legislation in their respective countries. WFD's comparative analysis could also become one of the important tools for us to identify challenges and opportunities which could help us play a more active role in the alignment and initialization of anti-bribery policies. SEAPAC will continue to foster anti-corruption and is open to collaborating to strengthen good governance cooperation. This webinar is open to not only SEAPAC and GOPEC members, but also all parliamentarians members in the Southeast Asian region. I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion. I know there are still many challenges ahead in the exercise of our duties to legislate and enforce the legal framework of anti-bribery laws. But together, the force will be stronger and our small steps will become greater. I encourage my fellow parliamentarians who are not yet a member to join our GOPEC SEAPAC membership, and let's work together for a better region free from bribery and corruption. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, next, opening remarks by Mr. Franklin de Vrieze, Senior Governance Advisor of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, expert on post-legislative scrutiny, independent oversight institutions, financial accountability, and anti-corruption issues. Mr. Franklin de Vrieze, the floor is yours.
Thank you, honorable members of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from London. It's a pleasure being with you and welcoming you to today's meeting on behalf of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. I would like to thank the Indonesian House of Representatives and the Southeast Asian Network of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, SEAPAC, for co-hosting this event today. And I would like to acknowledge Honorable Mr. Fadli Zon, Chair of the Interparliamentary Cooperation Committee of the Indonesian Parliament and the President of SEAPAC, and Dr. Mardani Ali Sera, Deputy Chair of the Interparliamentary Cooperation Committee and the Secretary of SEAPAC. I value our cooperation very much. Thank you. I appreciate that all of you delegates take the time out discussing a very important issue, the question of how to combat bribery and the role of Parliament in this. I'm Franklin de Vrieze, the Senior Governance Advisor at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. So I work with our country teams of WFD around the globe and also in several of your countries in advising on how to build a strong Parliament, a stronger democracy, and share experiences from other countries and other parliaments. Now, one of the topics I'm very passionate about is how to combat corruption, how to give people equal opportunities and take out corruption practices in the functioning of the state, the government, and the public administration. In particular, for political leaders, that is a key issue, because politicians have many means of influencing policies. So leading by example is often the most important way of combating corruption. Our discussion today takes place at an interesting time when the global anti-corruption movement is gaining momentum. Significant events have reshaped the international agenda on combating corruption. Only a couple of weeks ago, the United Nations General Assembly hosted its first ever special session on corruption. And one of the significant outcomes was its political declaration, which listed a number of commitments agreed by all member states represented in the General Assembly. And several of these commitments are important for our discussion today, amongst others also on beneficial ownership transparency. The G7 recently took significant steps on the question of bribery when the G7 Interior and Security Ministers made a commitment to combat foreign bribery, sharing good practices and lessons learned for compliance with anti-corruption and bribery laws. And this is what we are doing today. The same issue is also taken forward by the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. And in a couple of months, the International Democracy Summit will take place, focusing on three themes: anti-corruption, combating authoritarianism, and protecting human rights. And it's quite significant that the International Democracy Summit makes the clear link between promoting democracy and combating corruption and bribery. So these are encouraging signals for our meeting today. Now, regarding combating corruption, it's also fair to say that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There is not one single approach across different situations. One needs to look at the specific national context and political system, the history, and the political culture. And it is indeed also about working politically to combat corruption. We need to look at the interests and the incentives, the political culture, and the pressure points to make progress in combating corruption. It doesn't happen by its own. There are indeed interests at stake. So it's not only about knowledge and skills, it's also about political will. It's not just about knowing what exactly is combating corruption, it's also about building the will to do so. Now, political will is not a fixed thing. It's not something which exists or doesn't exist. Political will is an evolving thing. Political will can be built and nurtured, can become stronger, and can become a very powerful tool. So building a culture of accountability and combating corruption, for that, members of parliament have a key role to play. But they are not the only ones. They can build with different partners. They can build partnerships with civil society, media, academics, and independent oversight institutions, such as, for instance, audit institutions. Now, how to do that? What is the role of Parliament in combating corruption? From my side, I would say a key role is the type of legislation adopted by Parliament and Parliament's role in overseeing its implementation and effectiveness. And over the past couple of months, I've worked with Professor McCusker on the question of bribery legislation, and I was very privileged to learn from his experience and research. He has analyzed how bribery legislation is designed, what concepts are behind it, what gaps exist, and how that legislation is being implemented. Professor McCusker is an expert in researching transnational crime, providing advisory services on anti-corruption strategies. But above all, he is the author of the comparative study on bribery legislation, which we are discussing today. So with that, I wish you a fruitful discussion today. Thank you for joining us.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed to the main discussion. The next session will consist of 4 presentations from our esteemed panelists, followed by an open discussion led by the Secretary of SEAPAC, Honorable Vice Chairperson of the Committee for Inter-Parliamentary Cooperation of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator, Bapak Dr. Mardani Ali Sera. Bapak Mardani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable Dr. Fadli Zon, Chief of the Committee for Inter-Parliament Cooperation of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Indonesia and also President of SEAPAC, Mr. Franklin De Vrieze, WFD Senior Government Advisor, Honorable Indonesian members of parliaments, we are happy here. So many Indonesian member of parliament and SEAPAC members attending the meeting. We have Mbak Roro, Mbak Irene, Mbak Rati, Mbak Emma, Ustazah Sakinah, Mbak Arzelti, and Mas Primus. Thank you very much. Honorable Cambodia members of parliament, Honorable Malaysia members of parliament, Honorable Thailand member of parliament, Honorable Timor-Leste members of parliament, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. Let me briefly introduce the importance of the meeting. Amid this most devastating pandemic in 100 years, fighting corruption has become an existential imperative. More than 12 trillion US dollars have been mobilized globally in relief packages, while millions of lives and livelihood are at stake. This leaves us with no choice but to work together in ensuring that the pandemic responses for the most vulnerable people are not disrupted by any form of corruption. One of the most prevalent and rampant form of corruption is bribery. In 2020, it is estimated that 1 in every 5 people who use a public service in ASEAN countries paid a bribe throughout the year. Also, according to the World Bank, businesses and individuals pay about 1 trillion US dollar in bribe annually. This phenomenon will seriously cause serious harms for the people and damage for long-term economic development. Hence, we urgently need sufficient regulations and strong control measures to combat bribery. Addressing bribery has always been an integral part in the global anti-corruption agenda. As Honorable Chair Dr. Fadli Zon previously mentioned on his opening remarks, the UN Convention Against Corruption and OECD Anti-Bribery Convention have become the international standard for anti-bribery policy in a growing number of countries. However, translating such measure into domestic legislations and policies still become quite a challenge. As parliamentarians, we have the responsibility not only to make but also to ensure the effective enforcement of legislation, including thus regulating the crime of bribery. It is thus important to ask, how is the current anti-bribery measures in our country? Has the current legislation effectively adapted the international standard? Has it sufficiently covered the transnational multifaceted nature of this crime, what can we learn from other jurisdictions and neighboring countries in the region to improve our anti-bribery legislations? These questions will be covered in today's discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate that we have Professor Rob McCasker with us today to open the discussions by sharing with us the comparative study of anti-bribery legislation that he recently wrote. Professor McCasker is a transnational crime consultant providing strategic and policy advice to international standard organizations, including the UN, the OECD, the USAID, the US Department of State, the NATO. He has provided advisory services on creating anti-corruption strategies to government and agencies from a number of jurisdictions, ranging from Cameroon, Denmark, Afghanistan, the Turk, and Caicos Island. He is also the Transnational Crime Director at Global Risk Alliance in London, and both a member of Global Advisory Board and partner, Senior Advisor Compliance at Strategic Swiss Partner in Zurich. Professor McCasker is the author of the recently published WFD Comparative Analysis of the UK Bribery Act 2010 and anti-bribery legislation in 3 selected jurisdictions. I think it is best for us to hear directly from him about the key findings of that study and what do we need to address in improving and ensuring the success of anti-bribery legislation. Before we proceed, allow me to remind you that the time allocation for each speaker is 10 minutes, and we will go to the question and answer session after all the panelists deliver their presentation. Now let me, without further delay, invite for McCasker to deliver his presentation. The Professor McCasker, the floor is yours.
Well, assalamu alaikum. Very good afternoon to you all. It's my great honor to be with you today to share some of the findings of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy report, particularly as it applies to Indonesia. I will not simply, of course, summarize the content of the legislation, since you, of course, created it, but rather to seek out and tease out a few elements for your consideration. It's always enjoyable to find out that your speaking allocation time has been cut by half from what you're expected to be. So I will go through this as fast as I can. And I'm sure the chair will give me a reminder if I go too far over my allotted time. In terms of broad context, it's important to recognize that legislation itself does not prevent or mitigate the issues it supposedly governs. So in that sense, bribery cannot be solved simply by having legislation in place. However, to tackle bribery and corruption, it's crucial that the provisions of the governing legislation detail very clearly and concisely what types of behavior constitute bribery. For me, a useful indicator of the effectiveness of bribery legislation is to pose a simple question. Do the actions of person A, who stands before us, constitute bribery? Is it easy to work it out? Now, if we take the UK Bribery Act as an example, person A's actions under that act would constitute bribery if, for example, under section 1 of that law, bribing another person, person A offers a bribe or promises to give a bribe to another person. In the UK legislation, it's as simple as that. There's no need for categories, there's no need for any more discussion. It's a simple fact to be determined. In terms of the report that we're discussing today, it is a comparative analysis of the UK Bribery Act and legislation in the Ukraine, Kenya, and Indonesia. Why were these countries chosen? Well, each country has a degree of influence over their respective regions, so Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. And those regions reflect an appropriate level of geographical diversity, and the selected countries hold significant levels of influence in those locations. There is in each country a broad political interest in anti-corruption and anti-bribery policies. And importantly, of course, each country operates under a parliamentary democracy and has a sufficient amount of legislation for us to be able to make a comparative analysis. In order to ensure consistency of approach, each country was examined in terms of its legislation along the items you see on your screen there. So everything from what is a bribe, how is it defined, does the law cover foreign public officials, does the law apply outside of national borders, are corporations liable for the actions of their subsidiaries, are there a requirement for adequate compliance procedures to be implemented by corporations, and how effective are the enforcement mechanisms in terms of the legislation and how it's rolled out across the country. It's important to bear in mind, however, and this has been alluded to by one of your colleagues already, this report is an examination of legislation. It is not a report about the causes, the nature and extent of bribery and corruption. And in that context, the study recognises, but does not detail, that there may be a number of factors within each jurisdiction that may have an impact on the effectiveness of the implementation of its legislation. Those include political interference, bureaucracy, a lack of human and financial resources, and a lack of investigative and judicial capacity. Naturally, of course, if you can mitigate or eradicate those issues, you increase your chances of having effective legislation. As you know, there are two laws which apply to bribery and corruption in Indonesia, the anti-bribery law and the anti-corruption law. In practice, however, the prosecutions tend to invoke the anti-corruption law, so that the focus of your anti-bribery and anti-corruption efforts is the bribery and corruption of public officials within the context of the anti-corruption law, rather than through the anti-bribery law, which would seem to be a more logical position to take. Article 2 of your anti-bribery law does not define bribe, but it does define the act of bribery. And in that sense, you are already in an advantage over the UK Bribery Act, which doesn't define either of those terms. Bribery is defined under that act as giving or promising something with the intention to persuade the recipient to do or not to do something related to his or her duties, contrary to authority or obligations and contrary to the public interest. But unfortunately, Article 2 doesn't define public interest, and it would be useful, therefore, if that could be included. The anti-corruption law, of course, does not criminalise bribery in the private sector, and it's bribery in the private sector which is one of the biggest growers of corruption in jurisdictions through multinational enterprises. However, Article 378 of your criminal code indirectly captures the notion of private bribery by configuring such behaviour into a fraudulent act. But again, that seems an unnecessary complex step to have to take when we could simply put it into the anti-bribery legislation. The anti-corruption law provides a very broad definition of a public official, categorizing them as either government officials, including all forms of civil servants, anybody who receives a salary from a local or national government body, and state administered officials, those who perform the executive, legislative, and judicial functions, so would include your president, vice president, judges, ministers, and senior members of the military and the police. Questions been asked, of course, why are you so specific? Why do you try to list everything? Well, the answer could be that you don't want to leave any room for doubt as to who should or should not be captured within the legislation. But the problem can be, of course, is you can have the other issue, of course, is that if a person is not listed in one of those broad categories, it could be that that person is used as an intermediary for bribery transactions, because in the letter of the law, they could not be prosecuted. And that, again, is an advantage we don't want to give to people. The anti-corruption law does not expressly define a foreign public official, and the Bribery Act in the UK in particular, that was one of its key focuses, because it was seen to be a way in which a number of criminal elements were exploiting governments around the world. Nor does that anti-corruption law prohibit the bribery of foreign public officials. And that is an alleged contravention of Indonesia's undertaking to enact a legislative instrument about foreign public officials under its commitments to the UN Convention Against Corruption and in the spirit of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group number 2. However, curiously, again, Articles 2 and 3 of your anti-bribery law, namely anyone who gives or promises something to someone and anyone who receives something, could technically include foreign public officials. But in the international framework, that may not be deemed to be precise enough to meet international standards. In terms of a big area of concern in the United Kingdom, Article 12b of your anti-corruption law has a very broad definition of gratification. And it says that any gratification given to a civil servant or state apparatus will be regarded as a bribe if it has something to do with his or her position and is against his or her obligation or task. Now, in that sense, of course, every gratification provided to an official could be construed as a bribe. But the offence requires, under your law, a connection between the gratification and the position of the person receiving it, and an action or inaction in contravention of that person's duties. There is a curious burden of proof at play in your law as well, which is that if the gratuity amounts to 10 million rupees or less, the recipient of that money has to prove the gratuity was not a bribe. But if it amounts to more than 10 million rupees, the public prosecutor has the burden of proof. Now, that could be regarded as an issue in international quarters, because it might be assumed that an amount lower than 10 million rupees is either not as serious or is maybe not even a bribe. And it's best perhaps to assume that all payments made could be bribes unless evidence is proven otherwise. In Indonesia, the parent company is regarded as a separate legal entity and therefore not liable for the actions of its subsidiaries unless the parent company itself is involved in the criminal conduct. It's relatively easy, of course, for any corporation to maintain a degree of separation. But your Supreme Court Regulation number 13 on case handling procedures for corporate crimes may apply if the corporation obtained a benefit from the crime committed by the subsidiary, the corporation benefited from the crime was committed in the corporation's interests, and the corporation allowed the crime to be committed, didn't do anything about it. But it might be easier simply to have the legislation you have make a corporation liable for the actions of its subsidiaries, and then for the corporation to have to put up a defense. Your anti-corruption law does not provide specific compliance measures that must be in place within corporations, because clearly you don't currently legislate for corporations in the private sector, but it's something I think you're going to be called increasingly to do. The anti-corruption law also doesn't provide for any procedures to be in place for any corporation to be relied upon as a defense to a charge of bribery. Again, your Supreme Court Regulation number 13, one I just mentioned, does allow at the sentencing stage for a judge to assess the fault of the corporation by reference to, for example, whether or not the corporation failed to take mitigating measures. And again, it might be easier to specify compliance procedures and allow for a defence to be raised. So my overall conclusions for jurisdictions. The analysis of each country, including Indonesia, has shown that there was a significant and sometimes broad connection between the approach taken by each jurisdiction to the issue of bribery and corruption. The points of departure tended to relate to the variance in the way that basic concepts such as bribe, gratuity, etc. were defined, and the parameters of your legal traditions. And also, as has been mentioned already, the societal and political drivers and consequences of bribery and corruption, rather than to any lack of understanding about precisely what corruption was and bribery was. The countries, of course, in this study have all got different legislative architectures and different legal traditions. And whenever legislation in relation to any subject requires or permits interpretation of the meaning and scope of its provisions, difficulties in implementation undoubtedly follow. Bribery is too common and too destructive an issue for any further advantage to be given to the bribers by having legislation which is questioned in terms of its interpretation. So my final points. I suggest in this report that any jurisdiction that has lots of different pieces of legislation, consider putting that legislation into a single piece of legislation so that everybody knows exactly where to go in order to have bribery and corruption prosecuted. I recognize, of course, that for me to suggest a single piece of legislation is easier to suggest than it is for you to deliver it. Because again, you have different legal and cultural traditions. There's a distinction in terms of the way in which and the pace with which your legislation is created. And there are also complex socio-political environments within each jurisdiction, not least of all Southeast Asia broadly. However, in my view, and I express this in the report, it's equally dangerous not to suggest that approach simply because it might be difficult. Because as the Bribery Act in the UK has shown, if people know exactly what a bribe is, what an official is, without having to go through 17 different layers of categories, it's easier to bring a prosecution. Finally, it's important to point out that the UK Bribery Act is not better than other jurisdictions' legislation, as is sometimes said to be the case. But if you have a very comprehensive level of legislation, that can turn into complexity. And where the comprehensive becomes complex, it's difficult for parties to see the bribery wood of the legislative trees. So my ultimate message to you all is where it is possible, it's important to make it as simple as possible to know exactly who is a bribe maker, who is a bribe taker, and not over categorize your issues. And at that point, slightly over, for which I apologize, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Mikasker, for your clear explanations and insightful informations on the comparative report between UK, Indonesia. Now let us reflect on the current state and situation of anti-bribery legislation in Southeast Asia by exploring the experience and perspective from several countries in our regions. Firstly, I hope we can hear some Indonesian perspective to reflect the comparative analysis that just been presented by Professor Mikasker. To give more insight on that, as well as elaborate on the current state and prospect for anti-bribery law in Indonesia, I will invite Dr. Laude M. Sharif, Executive Director of Partnership for Governance Reform, or Kemitraan. He is also the former Commissioner of Indonesian Corruption Eradication Commission, KPK, from 2015 to 2019. He obtained his doctoral degree in law from the University of Sydney. He has more than 25 years of experience in education, environmental governance, and anti-corruption, and has developed anti-corruption and environmental law clinics in several law schools in Indonesia. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Laude Muhammad Syarif to share his talk. Pak Laude, the floor is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to share my presentation, and thank you very much for very comprehensive introduction from Professor McCarthy, because I think I don't really need to add some more of this explanation because it is very comprehensive. But let me try to address why it is important to address anti-bribery law, not only in Indonesia, but in Southeast Asia, as mentioned by Dr. Fadli Zon and Dr. Mardani Ali Sera. I think based on my limited experience that bribery is still a major problem in most Asian countries. And I think with the exception, of course, for Singapore, for example, but us, it is still a major problem. If we look at the state of corruption in ASEAN based on Corruption Perception Index since 2020, for example, Singapore is among the top 10 as always with 85 points. Brunei Darussalam follow with 60 and Malaysia 53. Brunei Darussalam 60 and Malaysia 55, which is actually down from 2019, and Indonesia actually down from 40 to 37. So if you actually look at the state of corruption in ASEAN country, yeah, we are still a long way to go. And I'm very, very happy that I'm invited by the parliaments to talk on this issue. If you actually look at an Indonesian case, for example, when I was a commissioner of corruption eradication commissions, most cases, actually about 80% of cases, it is mostly on bribery. Of course, there are some other elements like extortion, obstruction of justice, and procurement of goods and services, but all of them, the mother of those crimes are bribery. So this is why it is very, very important to be addressed. And the real evidences of public official that actually caught with bribery, I'm very, very sorry, but I mean, I just go very fast. They are very, I mean, there are several public officials has been actually prosecuted under the bribery law. Let's see some comparative perspective from UK and from Singapore about bribery. I think Professor Rob McCarthy has already explained it, so I don't think it is important for me to repeat it. But if we are looking at UK Bribery Act, yeah, they are focusing on bribery itself, which is actually a bit different from Indonesian emphasis, usually on Article 2 and 3 about the state laws. And if you actually look at this, has been explained by Professor McCuster, said I don't really think that are necessary for me to repeat. But the Bribery Act penalty, it is quite severe. For example, maximum penalty can be up to 10 years imprisonment. But this one, it is very important, is that for corporation, once actually convicted, they face automatic perpetual debarment from tendering for even EU public contract, this is very, very difficult. Another aspect of it is that Bribery Act, it is applied for public official, foreign public official, corporation, and individuals. So which is also a bit different from Indonesia, which I'm going to explain it later. How about the Singapore? Singapore also similar. They are not have some kind of like very clear definition about bribery, but in fact they are in the term fall under the term of gratification, which is money or any gift, loans, etc., etc. And any person who offer gratification to member of parliament, for example, it is also prohibited. And the maximum prison, if they are committed bribe, it is 7 years with fine or both. Singapore, similar to UK, it is actually applied for public official, foreign public official, corporation, and individual, which is very different from the Indonesian law. As explained by Rob McCasters, we have at least 3 laws, or basically 2 laws in Indonesia that actually address bribery, but most of the time we do not apply law number 11 to 1980 on criminal act bribery, and we mostly focusing on law number 20 on 2001. If you actually look at the Indonesians' way of defining bribery, the law it is applied for the givers, for the bribers, and also for the receivers of the bribe. And the law itself actually differs. I mean, the maximum penalty for the givers, it is only 5 years, while the receiver, it is much higher. For example, in bribing, if you are bribing a judge, it is also different. They have a specific article on that. It can actually minimum 3 years imprisonment and maximum 15 years if you are trying to bribe a judge. I think in a way forward for ASEAN country, I think the Indonesia and other ASEAN countries shall adopt, if it is not yet, all United Nations Convention Against Corruption provisions within their national law. And bribery shall be prohibited not only for public officials, but also for foreign public officials and among private sectors, this is one of the main weaknesses of Indonesian law, because it's not cover bribe in private sectors. But if actually look at the practice of Indonesian private sectors, it is very, very high probability among them, especially state-owned companies with other private sectors. If you look at the bribe receivers, it is actually higher and far less role they play. For example, it is only 1 year and up to 5, and which is actually quite rare. Even I was in a KPK applying this law. Of course, there are 1 or 2 cases, but usually because they just kind of like a trading of influence on that. And while receiver, it is quite high, which is actually even highest in many other countries, like Singapore, maximum 7 years. We are here in Indonesia up to 20 years, even actually life imprisonment, which is very, very high. Also in Indonesia, we differentiate between gratifications and bribe, which is sometimes also it is quite problematic. So we need to redefine this. Special homework for Indonesia, I think, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope Mardani Ali Sera, Fadli Zon, I think it is a homework for us to criminalize bribery in private sectors and foreign public officials, because not yet covered by the current law, trading in influence, and also asset recovery. We can actually make that amendment through the revision of law number 20/2001, or through criminal code that's now still under a discussion in the Parliament. So I think it is very, very important for us to include those. And again, let me finish with this. A friend of mine, Heidi Mendoza, said, fighting corruption is like being a mother. You have no right to stop, and giving up is not an option. Long life struggle, and the Parliament must take a lead. And I thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laude. A very brief and specific and insightful perspective. The homework for Parliament especially has been noted, and we will continue cooperating. Like your friend Mendoza said, that fighting corruption is like being a mother, and it's a really, really touch sentence. Let we move to another lessons from my fellow parliamentarians from Malaysia, Honorable Datuk Haji Hasanuddin bin Muhammad Yunis. He is the member of Dewan Rakyat, the House of Representatives of Malaysia. He is also the Vice President of SEAPAC and the Vice President of the National Trust Party Malaysia. We are hoping to hear from him about the best practices in adopting the anti-bribery legislative measures in Malaysia, including those covered in the newly amended Malaysia Anti-Corruption Act. Datuk Hasanuddin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon to Honorable Dr. Fadli Zon, President of SEAPAC, Mr. Franklin, Senior Advisor of WFD, Dr. Mardani, Secretary of SEAPAC, Professor Rob, WFD expert, Mr. Londe Sharif, Director of Kemitraan, Mr. Francisco, UNODC Advisor, and to all of my fellow friends. I would like to thank SEAPAC, DPR Indonesia, and Westminster Foundation for Democracy, WFD, for inviting me today. The title given to me is Enforcing Anti-Bribery Measures in the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act. Corruption is a phenomenon that is found everywhere in all states, but not all states are dominated by corruption. The type of state dominated by corruption can be referred as a kleptocracy. The key kleptocrats are not low or middle level civil servants, but high level bureaucrats and politicians who engage in negative corrupt activities. In Malaysia, the general election of 2018 is a wake-up call to the National Front that they had lost the support of great numbers of voters. Malaysians do not want a government filled with those who use their office to seek personal gain at the expense of the government. The popular word is enough during that time. Al-Mawardi, a Muslim scholar, was concerned with the administration system of the government. His book, Al-Ahkam Al-Sultaniyah wal Wilayat Ad-Diniyah fil Idarah Al-Hukumiyah, or in English, the Sultanic Rules, he emphasized about the government responsibility to the citizens and to manage their various affairs effectively, including integrity, trust, responsibility. Al-Amanah, or they call anti-corruption. Responsibility or amanah is the duty of using power and authority in appropriate way in pursuit of objective given by others in the authority. Malaysia has its share of problems and must be addressed urgently. The main anti-bribery measures in Malaysia is Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, or what they call MACC Act 2009 or Act 694. Before Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission was formed, it is being called Anti-Corruption Agency back in 1967. Parliamentarians play a central role in ensuring openness and transparency which may exist in curbing corruption. Accordingly, the oversight power possessed by parliamentarians shall be enhanced in helping the alignment of broader anti-bribery policies. Therefore, in practices Parliament of Malaysia, transparency measures have taken place in asset declaration and gift management policy by members of the administration, including Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, has been implemented. Follow suit by the approval of special motion, Code of Ethics of Administrative Members and MP for all members of Parliament, senators, as well as their immediate family members, such as wife, to declare their assets. Trust of amanah must be faithfully observed. Some religions mentioned in their books and betrayal of trust is strictly forbidden. Fighting corruption also form part of their principle of prevention of evil, what they call nahi munkar, a duty the leader and those in charge of community affairs. No matter how good the policy is, it always comes to political will and policy enforcement for the impact to be seen, especially in transparency, accountability, and good governance. Through their legislative roles, parliamentarians shall pressure the government and the leaders to provide the leadership and strong political will to drive the message of zero tolerance for graft through robust action. Lack of political leadership and political will be implement anti-corruption control have affected the sustainability and the effectiveness of anti-corruption initiative undertaken thus far. As a result, most, if not all, corruption deterrent initiatives are either late, slow, or unpopular to be implemented. The government is also addressing corruption by promoting transparency, accountability, and integrity in all government's administration, as outlined in Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goal SDG, which is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, build effective, accountable, and including institution at all levels. Transparency, accountability, dignity, integrity, ethical behavior, morals, respect, and trust cannot be bought. These values shall be instilled in all parliamentarian mindset. Good governance requires credible and trustworthy institution built on principle of transparency and accountability. Both of the fundamental principles must be held together to uphold public administration and government reform. Without transparency, there is no accountability, and without transparency, accountability become meaningless. The pillar of MACC Act 2009 is Section 16, whereby any person who by himself or in conjunction with any other person, subsection A, corruptly solicits or receive or agree to receive for himself or for any other person, or subsection B, corruptly give promises or offers to any person, whether for the benefit of that person or of another person, is coming an offense. In Malaysia, giving bribe is also an offense. Another important section in MACC Act 2009 are section 23 and 25. In section 23, subsection 1, any officer of a public body who uses his office or position for any gratification, whether for himself, his relative or associate, commits an offense. In section 25, subsection 1, any person to whom any gratification is given, promised or offered in contravention of any provision of this act shall report such gift, promise or offered such gratification to him, to the nearest officer or the commission of police officer. And in subsection 2, any person who fails to comply with subsection 1 commits an offence shall on conviction be liable to a fine not exceeding 100,000 ringgit Malaysian money, or to imprisonment from a term not exceeding 10 years or both. To keep up to date, the MACC Act 2009 is also being revised from time to time, and there are amendments if needed. For example, the implementation of the cooperative liability provision involving commercial organizations under section 17A, which stipulates a corporate liability principle where a commercial organization can be considered guilty if any of its employees and or associates commits corruption for the benefits of the organization. The commercial organization is also considered guilty in the event whether or not the upper management of its representative know about the corruption acts committed by its employees or associate. This provision encourages commercial organization to take parallel steps to ensure business and free from corruption. The other anti-bribery measure in Malaysia is developing a national anti-corruption plan, they call NACP, supervised by the National Center for Governance, Integrity and Anti-Corruption GIACC under the Prime Minister Department. On 29 January,
your time 1 minute remaining.
Okay, thank you. On 29 January, Dr. Hadir, as the Prime Minister, then launched the NACP with the objective of making Malaysia known for its integrity and not corruption, building a corrupt-free nation that uphold accountability. The successful implementation of the OACP is continuing. Effectiveness will largely depend on the commitment of the organization leadership. Other factors are participation of officials at all levels in the organization who must regard the needs to improve governance. So let's pray and work so that this region will be free from corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Datuk Hasanuddin bin Muhammad Yunus, for your insightful presentations where the MEC Act addressed many crucial issues in preventing corruptions, including the transparency measures to declare assets of public officials, the importance of political leadership to ensure strong enforcement of the zero tolerance against corruption policy, and also MACC Act amendment to corporate liability principles. Thank you very much. Our last panelist of the day is Mr. Francesco Cesi, Anti-Corruption Regional Advisor for Southeast Asia, United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, UNODC. He has more than 15 years of experience working in international organizations in the area of good governance, public administration reform, and anti-corruption. His work focuses on providing support to member states of the UN Convention Against Corruption for implementing on the convention. I believe that his deep expertise on regional anti-corruption effort will provide important input for our discussion, especially to explain about anti-bribery regime in Southeast Asia. We hope that he could share the current state and challenges in the region, as well as way forward to help strengthening parliamentary response to the multifaceted crime of bribery. Mr. Cesi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start on behalf of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime by thanking the SEAPAC, Honorable Mr. Fadli Zon, and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy for organizing this very timely discussion and for inviting me to participate in the panel. The discussion so far has been extremely interesting, and I'm sure it will contribute to the development of anti-bribery legislations in the region. Now, given the time constraints, I will make just some general observation based on the review of implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, taking also into consideration some of the recent development in the region in terms of criminalization of bribery. As you probably all know, the UN Convention Against Corruption contains a series of measures requesting state parties to criminalize various forms of corruption, bribery, of course, active and passive, bribery of foreign public officials, also active and passive, but also embezzlement and diversion of funds by public official, abuse of function, trading in influence, illicit enrichment, bribery in the private sector, embezzlement in the private sector, and so on. So it's very broad. But also importantly, there is an article 26, that requires the establishment of the liability of legal persons. So I will just focus on a few aspects because, of course, in 10 minutes I cannot cover everything, and the aspects that I think are particularly interesting in relation to the UK Bribery Act are foreign bribery and the liability of legal persons. So foreign bribery, as per Article 16 of the UNCAC, as I mentioned, it has active and passive sides. We are interested in an active side, which is also a mandatory offense. So countries that have ratified the convention have to establish as a criminal offense the promise, offering, or giving to a foreign public official or an official or of a public international organization of an undue advantage in order that the official act or refrain from acting in the exercise of his or her official duties in order to obtain or retain business or another undue advantage in relation to the conduct of international business. So this is the article, the reading of the article. So the measure clearly finds its application with regard to companies conducting business abroad and bribing in various forms to obtain a business advantage. And you will see why this is particularly relevant in the region. Other important article I want to mention is Article 26 of the UNCAC, which requires the introduction of liability of legal persons. This is also a mandatory requirement. The liability may be criminal, civil, or administrative. Such liability shall be without prejudice to the criminal liability of the natural person who have committed the offense. So both natural and legal person can be prosecuted. So when I arrived in the region in 2015, as UNODC advisor, we started looking at the level of implementation of these measures in the region, among the others, of course. And as the review of implementation of the UNCAC showed, Article 16 and 26, respectively, foreign bribery and liability of legal person, were among the articles that were most problematic, in the sense that they were not implemented or badly implemented in the majority of the countries. So many countries received the recommendation to improve implementation of these articles from the review of implementation of UNCAC. Some countries, despite their not really implementing them properly, did not receive a specific recommendation because they claimed that the definition of public official with regard to bribery was so broad that it covered also foreign officials. And in some cases, also they claimed that the general reference to persons in the code, in the penal code, was also covering legal person. So there were legal argumentation of the source in the review of implementation of the UNCA, but the hard fact remained that in practice, countries in the region at the time had not prosecuted, let alone adjudicated cases of corruption involving directly legal person, especially if the cases were in foreign jurisdictions, with very, very few exceptions. So we are talking about what was the situation in 2015, how the situation has evolved. Okay, on the issue of liability of legal person, there has been progress. So several countries have really moved ahead. We have heard on Indonesia. I would say on Indonesia, we have to see the glass half full, as we may say. Some companies have already been convicted for bribery, so really a good achievement there. Malaysia, with the newly introduced Section 17 of the anti-corruption law, has also introduced the liability of legal persons. So we are looking forward to seeing how this will be implemented. The other country in the region where things have evolved quite strongly is Thailand, as mentioned by Dr. Fadli Zon, at least in terms of the legal framework. Thailand really made big steps ahead with the 2015 and 2018 revisions of the anti-corruption law. So I want to talk briefly about Thailand because it's the other good example we have in the region. So under the new law, legal entities, including corporations, can be criminally liable for bribes given to Thai state officials, foreign state officials, and officials of international organizations. So this is in compliance with Article 16 of the UNCAC. The legal entities are liable also when the bribe is provided by an associated person, which can include employees, joint ventures, agents, and so on. The other important aspect is that the law now also includes foreign juristic persons, meaning that it applies to organizations that are registered abroad but operating in Thailand. This would cover situation where a company may not have a physical presence in Thailand but is using local agents to win government contracts, for example. So the new anti-corruption law also allows legal entities to reduce the liability if they have proper internal controls. So the NACC, the National Anti-Corruption Commission of Thailand, has also released a set of guidelines explaining what are these appropriated internal control. And with regard to the punishments, a legal entity can be punished with a fine of at least an equal amount of the benefit received from the corrupt acts, but not more than twice that amount. So overall, this is a good law. I just wanted to mention this as an example, even though implementation is still uncertain, so to speak. It has to be moved forward. Pak Laude already mentioned the example of Singapore, so I will not repeat that. But you know, this is the Prevention of Corruption Act of Singapore has effect on Singaporean citizens, even if they are abroad, out of the country, and the corruption of foreign public official by a Singaporean citizens outside will be an offense under the act. Liability of legal person is also covered by the act, but the act does not recognize compliance program as a mitigating factor that will eliminate liability for companies. We have heard also Timor-Leste, as it was mentioned, has a new anti-corruption law that UNODC also contributed in developing with some advice. The law contains a specific definition of foreign official and includes the liability of legal persons. Here again, we have to see how this will be implemented. For the other countries in the region, overall, I must say, foreign bribery and liability of legal persons are not yet there. Vietnam recently introduced a new anti-corruption law. They introduced the liability of legal persons for money laundering, but not for corruption, and that was a pity. And also Vietnam remains largely non-compliant with regard to foreign bribery. So why are there so many challenges? We have to consider also, of course, the issue of enforcement of this foreign bribery legislation and, you know, liability of legal persons. The enforcement is quite challenging. It takes a long time and resources to investigate and prosecute these cases, in particular for foreign bribery. Beside the legal basis, there is a need for trained investigator and prosecutor, but also for a good framework of international cooperation to be able to collect the evidence. There are jurisdictional challenges at times, and also generally, I think the authorities in the region are a bit resistant to endorsing the idea of prosecuting companies doing business abroad, especially, you know, developing economies that do not have a large number of multinational companies. Certainly, some of the countries in the region do not see, you know, introducing this type of legislation as a priority. But I have to remind that these are mandatory offenses as per the UN Convention Against Corruption that all countries in the region have ratified. So I will stop here with my comments, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Chair, that I give you back the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jesse. Important provision of UNCAC that have to be ratified by signature countries, the liability of legal persons, active and passive bribery, and foreign bribery. The need of stronger international cooperation in prosecuting foreign bribery is some of the aspects that Mr. Jesse has already mentioned in his presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Jesse. After hearing presentation from all our distinguished panelists, now I would like to hear some thought from representatives of our national chapter SEAPAC before proceeding to the open discussion. First, one representative from Cambodia Parliament and Gopak, Cambodia, maybe want to share some brief thought. I will invite Honorable Auk Damri to speak. Honorable Auk Damri, the floor is yours.
Okay, yes, thank you. In joining in the decisions, now I would like to have some comment on this anti-corruption and anti-bribery. Now, in the field of the anti-corruption, anti-bribery in Cambodia, we have also, established many law, and also we try to reinforce and encourage, promote or using, digital electronic payment. Mostly we promote the people, encourage people to use digital electronic payment service in order to eliminate bribery on table or under table. Even we pay the tax, we pay everything through the public and through the private by using mostly digital material, which is provide both public and private sector and play us important role to promote financial inclusions and a transparent regulations framework is required to support the growth of the sector and anti-bribery offense. The mobile internet subscribe in Cambodia now by the Ministry of Telecom. They reported about user around 17 million among 16 million. That means some people use 2 or 3 mobile phones. As for this year, which has increased about 7% of the compared with the same period last year, and now is about 25 million people. Therefore, the number social media use increased 24%, around 14.3 million compared to the last year. In Cambodia, the Anti-Corruption Institute was established by the anti-corruption law, which are promulgated in 17 April 2010. This is some like Mahasudabri concern Prime Minister of Cambodia. He's always said that combating corruption is to make people not to wish to corrupt and cannot corrupt, and they're not to corrupt. Another one, we have to fighting corruption. If we could not fighting the corruption, we could not survive. This is something always mentioned. And effective in implementation, ACU has established in own internal investigation and focal point of anti-corruption official at various ministry, institution, aim to take several measures in terms of investigation, prevention on corruption. At the same time, the Cambodian Parliament cooperate with national institutions and international institutions, such as member of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, and also with the non-government NGO to find out the issue related to the responsibility of the Commission and deliberate to the anti-corruption unit to take action. And relate to the law, as we are rather referred to the offering, giving, soliciting, or receiving or any item of values as mean of influencing action of the individual holding the public or legal duty. The legislative of Cambodia and government has strong commitment to combat corruption as well as the anti-bribery offense by examining the draft law and propose law and adopt the law related to the field of investigation on the specific offense and anti-corruption. Meanwhile, the Commission on Anti-Corruption of the National Assembly received and refused complaints related to the corruption and interviews with relevant authorities and institutions to resolve the complaint. The anti-corruption regulations cover both public and private sector and also include the commercial bribery between private entities. Meanwhile, the anti-corruption as well anti-bribery offense stipulated in anti-corruption law promulgated on the 17th April 2010, such as Article 32 anti-corruption law stipulate offense in the criminal code. Article 33 bribery taken by foreign public official or official. Article 34 bribery offered to foreign public official. Article 35 stipulate on the abuse of power. 37 on illicit enrichment, and Article 36 corruption proceed, and Article 39 punishment for not declaring asset and liability. Certifies linkage on the confidential information on corruption, etc. You know that the anti-corruption laws is not just only for the official, but for private sectors also. Taking this opportunity, I would like to express my appreciations and support for the webinars. I hope that this webinar will have fruitful results, and we have continued our cooperation to make our duty success. Thank you very much. Let's see.
Thank you very much, Honorable Damri, by sharing the current situations of the act to combat corruption in Cambodia. Your Excellency stressing about need for actions, and it is really, really important for us. Next, I will invite another Southeast Asian parliamentary representative, one fellow member from Parliament of Timor-Leste and Gopak Timor-Leste. Would you like also to share some brief thought to us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. First of all, we would like to express our highly appreciation to the President or Chairman of the SEAPAC, Honorable Mr. Fadli Zon, who initiated this event so that we can share our thoughts and findings. Second, we would like also to express our highly appreciation to the speakers who have shared their thoughts and findings on bribery and corruptions. As a new nation, of course, as the speaker, one of the speakers mentioned that we just actually approve our law on anti-corruption. We would like to inform you that actually our president already promulgated the law, but we haven't implemented yet, since we still need some technical things to be fixed. Therefore, maybe in a couple of months we'll implement it soon. Therefore, we would like also ask through SEAPAC or GOPAC to really assist us, maybe reviewing our legislation that we just approved. We consider that there are three important laws that need, hands from our colleagues through SEAPAC or GOPAC. Our anti-corruption laws, our money laundering law, and as well our penal code. After listening from the speakers that say about other countries' laws, the penalty that we put in our law is very, very low. Like Indonesia, very high, even in more than 10 years, and etc. But we have 2 to 4 years. So although we as you know, that we have one of the speakers mentioned that it is important to have a political will. Of course, we have a political will, and we also already have had these laws, but we need, time to implement it. So that's why I proposed through SEAPAC and GOPAC, maybe we need an expert to review or to help us see, and maybe can do comparative studies between our laws and others, so that later on the parliamentarians can also review it, can see it in the future, so that we can make adjustment with other country members, SEAPAC members. So that's what I would like to say. We haven't had a comment yet, because we are still waiting for the implementation of the newly law that our president just promulgated. But we still really need your assistance to review, to do a study on legislation that we just passed, approved. And again, lastly, I would like to thank you to Mr. Chairman and all members of Parliament, and also speakers who have shared their thoughts and findings. It's a very valuable, information and thoughts. We are here 3 parliamentarians, so we of course bring these thoughts and findings in how do you call it, in building our own, in enforcing our own capacity to see, to regulate the bribery practices in our country and in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Adriano do Nascimento, and participant from Timor-Leste, Gopak Timor-Leste. No, there's also a participant from National Assembly of Thailand. Is there any representative want to share a brief thought? Okay. I have been informed that the participant from Thailand just want to hear the webinars. Okay. Let we continue to our next sessions and open discussions, and I would like to give the floors to the Indonesian Parliament's delegation. There are so many people attending the meeting. I would like give the floor to Miss Dia Roro Esti. Miss Dia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace and blessings be upon you. His Excellency, Mr. Fadli Zon, Chair of the Interparliamentary Cooperation of the Indonesian Parliament, His Excellency, Mr. Mardani, also Vice Chair of the Interparliamentarian Cooperation, who both are also leaders within the SEAPAC community, and also members of Parliament in Indonesia, Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and also Timor-Leste. Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation that has been given to us. We were able to learn a lot, particularly with how corruption is being tackled in various countries across Asia. And I would like to agree that political will is a very predominant thing in this scenario, and legislators play a very strategic role in ensuring that political will exists within the system. And I think one of the key things is to make sure that there is a culture of accountability, which has been mentioned earlier as well. And this is something that we have very much committed towards within the Indonesian Parliament. And we are very open as well to partnerships that can be formed amongst not only parliamentarians, but also between institutions, and are very open to collaborations with civil society organizations or with the government as well. When we talk about the solutions to corruption, apart from existing political will, I think one of the most important things also is to ensure that the legislations being put in place is implemented in the best way, and also being overseen in the most optimal way as well. In Indonesia, we have three, as earlier mentioned. We have the Corruption Eradication Commission, or Komisi Pemberantasan Korupsi, KPK. Also, the second, the police plays a significant role in ensuring that enough monitoring is being done, as well as the attorney. And we have earlier mentioned by the chair also of SEAPAC with regards to the legislations that are already in place. But I think one of the most important things is with the existing legislations is the overseeing aspect, right? We have to ensure that even the Corruption Eradication Commission is also doing their job in the most optimal way. And I think this check and balance system needs to be incorporated within how we eradicate bribery and also corruption. So I have a couple of questions here. The first question is, how can we build a culture or nurture a culture that is
cautious about corruption, and in a way where society and those in governments and positions of power are able to stay away from it by choice, right? So that's my first question. The second is, how can we improve the overseeing of corruption in general? And I think there's a lot that parliamentarians can do in this case. And also the third and last is there an existing global commitment or a global target being set in place? So I'm, aside from being a member of the Interparliamentary Cooperation, also a member of Commission 7, which deals with the energy sector, and also a member of GOPAC as well recently. So I'd like to ask, is there a global target? Because when we talk about climate change, we've ratified the Paris Agreement, and we know that there are 197 countries that's signed this agreement. So when we talk about bribery and corruption, is there a similar agreement in which includes the participation of countries around the world? And is there a global target that needs to be met? As of climate change, there are targets in Indonesia to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 29%. So I'm wondering whether a similar situation and scenario is being put in place when we talk about the eradication of corruption and bribery. That's from me. Thank you very much, Mr. Mardani.
Thank you very much, Honorable Diahroro ST. Is there any others delegations want to raise a question or giving a comment? If it is not, let we giving the opportunity to the panelists to answer or to give a comment or giving a note to what happened has been raised by the participants. Let me give the first opportunity to Professor Rob Mikaskers.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for those very insightful questions, ma'am. If I could make a few general comments in relation to those. You talk first of all, I think, of how to introduce a sort of culture of anti-corruption within a society. And I think that's a very important point, because corruption often goes on in societies because it's become sort of normal behavior. People expect there to be corruption, and therefore they don't worry if someone asks them for a bribe at a traffic stop, or someone asks them for a bribe when they want to get a form through. Often that bribe will be in the form of sort of speed money. In terms of creating the culture, you obviously have to start by the very young. So if you use Hong Kong as an example, its Independent Commission Against Corruption has a defined education section. And that education section works with children from primary school age right up to university students. And it encourages them through, for example, competitions to make short videos, essay writing competitions, and promotes those on television, on radio, and across social media, so that the children end up talking to their parents about what they've learned in school today about corrupt behavior. So their parents, wishing the best for their children, start to challenge what they've been used to dealing with on a day-to-day basis. In countries like Jamaica, where I've worked, there is what's called an eat a food mentality. And that simply means that the public expect there to be corruption around every corner. And therefore, they just become used to having to pay to get something done. And until you can tackle that feeling in society, there are going to be difficulties. Now, what a lot of NGOs have done around the world, principally in India, but also in Sierra Leone and other jurisdictions, is to actually utilize social media and the internet in order to get the public to start to stand up. So iPaidAbribe.com, for example, in India, allows you to report through mobile phones, through apps, through a website, even through a confidential phone line, where you have witnessed or been privy to corruption. So you ask the people to report whenever they paid a bribe to a police officer, to a government official, and that gets plotted on the website. And then you can start to see hotspots where there are particularly corrupt offices or particularly corrupt individuals. Now, as well as showing the public what to avoid, and that they're not alone in paying a bribe, there's also then a lot of data that the Indian governments in each of the regions of India can draw upon in order to then launch targeted prosecutions. So that's one brief aspect. The second thing related to that is it's important to understand the dynamics of corrupt behavior within organizations, either public sector or private sector. Now, what often happens is that you get an innocent person walking into an office, and then slowly over a period of time, they become involved in the corrupt behavior because they're taught how to rationalize their behavior. Now, we all rationalize, of course, every day of our lives. If we're caught speeding by a traffic officer, our first reaction often is, I wasn't going fast, or there were people going faster than I was. Why are you picking on me? And what happens in organizations is that the culture of the organization starts to make you stop challenging your own behavior. And that's the only way we can explain why corrupt behavior happens to the extent that it does. What makes somebody go from an ordinary member of the public with ethics engaging in corrupt behavior? And whilst we're waiting for that to happen, places like Singapore, for example, started to recognize that if you have one person who's known to be the person to go to for a contract or for a license, it's easier for that person to be corrupt if they are constantly in that position. So in the public sector in Singapore, staff members in procurement, for example, get rotated over a number of years so that no one person can build up a sort of empire. And sometimes it's just understanding how an objective third party looking in can show where the issues are. So I'll give you one brief example before I turn over to other colleagues. I was working for the UN in Kenya, and I was meeting with the procurement teams, and they were very proud to tell me that they had a committee which looked at all of the procurement bids, and they worked through all the criteria, and then they made a majority decision on who should get the contract. And I said, that's very good, thank you. And then somebody innocently put their hand up and said, except where our boss tells us we've made an error. And I said, I'm sorry? And they said, yes, sometimes when we've made a decision, our boss will tell us that he knows better than we do about that particular company, and therefore he recommends that we choose the company we didn't pick for the tender. And I said, well, that's an issue. And I asked them, the authorities, to look at that particular manager, and found out that he was connected to the companies who won the bid. Now, so sometimes if you're used to your boss having authority over you, you don't challenge your boss. And it's not until someone comes in and says, oh, well, that's not quite right, that you start to have changes being made. So those are my broad answers to your question.
Thank you very much, Professor Rob McCaskers, stressing about how to build the cultures, especially from the family. It's very interesting. Now let we give the opportunity to Pak Laude. Pak Laude, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ali Sera. Thank you also the very good question from Ibu Diar or ST. I just want to remind myself and all of us Indonesians, our first Vice President Muhammad Hatta stated that in 1961, do not let corruption to become part of Indonesian culture. I repeat it again, do not let corruption to become part of Indonesian cultures. He said that 61, when he starts seeing the government not what he has dreamed of. Or therefore, I think it is most important for us in order to create or to build a culture of anti-corruption, I think it is need to show some good example or to act as a role model. And I think Indonesia at the moment actually need that figure, just like Muhammad Hatta, for example. The second, following up on what just Professor Rob just mentioned about Hong Kong. I think before they start ICAC, I worked closely with ICAC when I was a commissioner of the KPK. Before they start with an education, they are focusing on eradicating corruption of the police officer. They really hard on eradicating corruptions on law enforcement agencies, because they knew exactly this is actually the core of a problem in Hong Kong. And later on, they created ICAC has very good education program and prevention program, which KPK actually, when the Indonesian Parliament decided to establish a KPK, one of the model actually used by the Indonesian government and Parliament was ICAC in Hong Kong, CPIB in Singapore, Malaysian anti-corruption agencies, and of course with some others example from FBI and from UK SFO. Another one, what is the importance of public education? I've asked once the ambassador of Denmark to Indonesia, because Denmark always rank #1 on corruption perception index. So I asked him, what is the recipe of Denmark to have such clean government? Whether they are very religious, and the ambassador smiled at me and told me that our churches, it is not many people actually going to church, sorry, unfortunately. So what is actually the ingredient for anti-corruption agency within the society? And he told me was, I think when we were started in school, our teachers already told us that public goods is different from private goods. For example, using a marker in class, you cannot actually use it for you if you want to draw something in your paper, because that one, it is a public good. They always emphasize the difference between governments or state or public goods than private goods. So, and cheating also, it is really prohibited. Dr. Mardani, Dr. Fadli Zon, if you look at the quality of our education, cheating is common not only at elementary school, but up to university. So I think this one of the core problems. So it is so difficult to create honest generation if since school they started cheating. I am fortunate. I've been teaching quite in many universities, and one of them actually I teach in Sydney Law School, and I experienced one which I will never ever forget, because during exam I asked my students to sit, maintaining distances, and one student was protesting at me, and she reported me to the dean. And because she thinks that I do not believe them. And I still remember the name of that my student, master class on ASEAN Environmental Law in that. But so since then, the dean actually asked me and said, no, you don't need to do that. They won't cheat. What you need, just look at them and provide their needs. This is very, very different when I teach my student here in Indonesia. I have to make sure there is a distance between one student with other student, otherwise they are going to cheat. I think that's all. And another important question from Ibu Dia, I think is talking about the importance of overseeing, how to oversee and ensuring the accountability of the government doing their work. I think this is very, very important. So that's why in my closing statement, in my presentation, I said that the Parliament has to take a lead because you guys actually have all the powers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Laude, with a very interesting perspective about combating corruptions from educations. So now let me give the opportunity to Datuk Haji Hasanuddin. The floor is yours.
No, don't get involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Datuk Haji Hasanuddin. Last but not least, Mr. Panceso Chesi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. These are extremely interesting, broad questions that I think it's difficult to address from a technocratic standpoint. But just maybe one observation is that in my experience, the countries that I see succeeding in promoting a culture of anti-corruption are the countries that have endorsed some values, and I don't want to necessarily speak about Western democratic values. That's much of a political and say connotation, but it is hard not to see that if you look at the CPI of Transparency International, for example, some of the most successful countries are those, let's say, democracies in Northern Europe. Pak Laude mentioned Denmark, but also Sweden, Finland, or of course these are countries that have peculiarities, and that probably makes it a bit easier for them to achieve this kind of results. But just to build on what Pak Laude was saying, there are also some specific values that they uphold, and that they are also in a way enshrined in the UN Convention Against Corruption. For example, the issue of transparency of public service, access to information, which is a requirement of the UNCAC as well. But it's also a value if you look at it from a broader perspective. So the fact that the public service has to be transparent, accountable, and that citizens have to have the capacity to get information and to ask what exactly the public administration is doing. That's a very important element. And, I must say that if we look at access to information laws in the region, there are challenges. There are challenges in several countries because of the fact that there are a lot of provisions that protect secrecy of certain state information, that makes it difficult administratively to get access to certain type of information. So that's one example. Another important value or principle, in my opinion, is the fact that different powers have to control each other. So I'm not referring, specifically to the fact that there has to be a multi-party democracy. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that powers, executives, legislative, they have to, in a way, judiciary also, they have to, in a way, control each other, and there has to be a balancing of those powers that allows for them to intervene if there is corruption, and this links also to the issue of oversight. I think it's an extremely important issue. I must say we have seen a tendency in some countries of erosion of the independence of specialized anti-corruption agencies. It is always a fight, a struggle to keep the oversight bodies independent, resourced, and capable to do their job. Because obviously the job of specifically anti-corruption agencies is to address corruption, even when it's high-level corruption, government corruption, and of course sometimes the powers fight back against these anti-corruption agencies. So I'm not referring to any case in particular. I'm just talking about, there are several examples of countries that are going through difficult times in terms of the independence of their oversight bodies. So yeah, there would be a lot of issues. In terms of, I also wanted to comment briefly on the issue of the global goal. There was a request to say something about the global goals and the fact that there are the goals under the Paris Agreement and the reduction of pollution, and so we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN. We have Goal 16. Goal 16 has some indicators, some targets, and for instance, an indicator that you have for reducing corruption and bribery speaks about reducing the proportion of persons that had to pay a bribe to public official, proportion of businesses that had to pay a bribe, or that they had to pay a bribe to conduct businesses. These are some of the indicators you have under the SDG frameworks. It's very difficult to have a big overarching goal for anti-corruption, but there are some reference there that you can use. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Francisco Chesi, and also Professor Romi Kasser, Honorable Haji Hasanuddin and Pak Laude. It is indeed an encouraging exchange of view that we must continue to follow in. But unfortunately, due to the time constraint, I'm afraid that we have to end these sessions. Please give applause to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you, Francesco.
Nice to see you all.
And
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Through our dynamic conversation, we realized the importance of strengthening and updating standard of the legal framework and anti-bribery. Hopefully, our discussion today could open more opportunities among parliamentarians to continue facilitate information exchange share progress and experience in enforcing anti-bribery measures, as well as engage in reciprocal learning across region on related issues. It has been a great pleasure to lead this discussion. I would like to thank all the panelists once again for spending your time with us and sharing your valuable perspective. I also thank all fellow parliamentarians for your participations. Our anti-corruption effort do not stop here. SEAPAC welcomes further collaborations and to address the most pressing challenge of corruption in our regions. Now I will give the floor back to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you, and I hope to see you again in other opportunities. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much. A round of applause once again, ladies and gentlemen, to our esteemed moderator and distinguished speakers for such an important and fruitful discussion this afternoon. And we are now coming to the end of today's webinar. We would like to invite Honorable Dr. Fadli Zon to wrap up the discussion and deliver his closing remarks. The floor is yours, Dr. Fadli Zon.
Thank you very much. Peace be upon us all, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests. Thank you, moderator, Dr. Mardani Ali Sera. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on the Southeast Asia Parliamentarians Against Corruption SEAPAC webinar under the theme of enforcing measures to combat bribery, comparative analysis on anti-bribery legislations, UK and Southeast Asia. So this event is initiated by the Committee for Interparliamentary Cooperation of the Indonesian House of Representatives, co-organized by SEAPAC and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. And the time goes by so fast, we now have to come to the end of our discussion. And it is indeed an important topic that we need to discuss. And I'm glad that we gain more knowledge and hear more perspectives on the anti-bribery legislations from the presenters, as well as from my fellow parliamentarians. And many thanks and appreciation to all parliamentarians, SEAPAC members, and GOPEC national chapters out in Southeast Asia for your participation and contribution during this webinar. I also appreciate the Westminster Foundation for Democracy's continued support and cooperation, and also thank to all panelists for their remarkable insight and knowledge on the matter. On our discussion today has raised crucial notion that bribery is the mother of all corruption. And it is highly prevalent, as Mr. Laude said, even comprises 80% of all corruption cases prosecuted in Indonesia, and almost the same across the region. It is our duty as parliamentarians to help ensure that it will not become the single greatest barrier to a well-functioning government. A true commitment to combat bribery demands more than words or laws. It demands enforcement and strong political leadership. And I thank all panelists to highlight the crucial efforts that could be done to assure the sufficient enforcement and push forward the collective political will. Professor Robert McCusker, thank you for sharing your study and takeaway points that we can learn to strengthen our national anti-bribery laws. Thank you, Dato' Haji Hasanuddin, for your remarkable presentation on enforcing anti-bribery measures in Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act. We learned a lot from your experience. Mr. Francesco Chesi, thank you for providing us an overview inside of the Southeast Asian anti-bribery regime. And thank you, Pak Laude Sarif, for input on Indonesia prospect for anti-bribery law. So this is only the beginning. I hope that we could continue to foster our partnership to create an effective parliamentary mechanism for better anti-bribery legislation in Southeast Asia. In the near future, SEAPAC will have more programs and activities to foster anti-corruption partnerships for parliamentarians in the Southeast Asian region, and I wish you all could join us in our future endeavors. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fadli Zon, President of SEAPAC, for the wrap-up remarks. And our gratitude to honorable members of parliament who are attending this event. If interested to join SEAPAC, you are welcome to fill out the online registration form through the link provided on the chat or by contacting the Secretariat through email at seapac@dpr.go.id. And now we would like to invite all honorable guests to join together for a photo session. All distinguished guests in the Zoom platform are kindly requested to turn the cameras on, please. Thank you. For a photo session. All right, ready for this photo session? Okay. On my count of three, ready? 1, 2, 3. Click. Perfect. Thank you very much. A round of applause once again, ladies and gentlemen. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are now concluding this special event. Our gratitude to all of you for your presence and participation. Kami ucapkan terima kasih atas kehadiran Bapak dan Ibu sekalian dalam acara ini, baik yang hadir langsung di tempat acara maupun yang mengikuti acara ini secara virtual. Selamat sore, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih.
Dan selanjutnya kami mengundang Ketua dan Wakil Ketua BKSAP serta para anggota DPR RI untuk berfoto di depan backdrop. Kami persilahkan.
Kami bisa pergi ya, yang online, Ibu Moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yang online, terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih Pak Mardani, terima kasih Pak Fadli. Terima kasih.
Sinanggar tulo tulo atulo, sinanggar tulo tulo atulo, sinanggar tulo tulo atulo, sinanggar tulo atulo, sinanggar tulo atulo, sariada ondanai, dasian on tulang gubo. Dan dapat siro kami to Sinanggar tulo Ampar pisang Pisangku belum masak Masak sebiji di burung bari-bari nang manang betis tutu di KTP Jawa nang manang betis tutu di KTP Jawa hidup sauyuna tarata hiri-hiri silitikannya ate incing belapati manuja dalingan tung silo kasinatria kersa una bangsa di negara Indonesia manu jajawi manu panggagahna bela bangsa di Indonesia jaya manu dadali pangga koncarana resep ngahiji rukun sakabena Angin memiriku pasang ngana tu sarua takkan lupa aku le nama mengurangi tu tenaya Pak Rizina Hey, yang kerame yang ko aronawa kombe Hey, yang kerame yang ko aronawa kombe Demi no kibe kubara kombe ko yubara punya awe ae Honke 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 jame honke 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 rio honke jame rio honke honke jame rio Dari Sabang sampai Merauke berjajar pulau-pulau Sambung menyambung menjadi satu Itulah Indonesia Dari Sabang sampai Merauke berjajar pulau-pulau Sambung menyambung menjadi satu Itulah Indonesia Tanah air ku tidak lupakan dan terkenang selama hidupku satu nusa satu bahasa tanah